And welcome back to the science sessions. We'll give people a few more seconds to get on. All right, so we've got a full schedule of presentations today. We have 3 in the next hour and 3 more at 3:30, so we're going to get right to it. Please remember to use the Q&A function to submit questions during the presentations, and the speakers will answer those when they're done. So first up this afternoon is Desi Siebürth. Desi is an incoming sophomore at Stanford University. He was awarded the WFO Youth Scholarship in 2014 and was named the 2015 American Birding Association Young Birder of the Year. Desi is a board member of the Los Angeles Birders Organization and has previously conducted research on the morphology of golden-cheeked woodpecker and molt in rufous hummingbirds. And today, Desi will speak to us on how molt phenology provides potential insight into the at-sea distribution of Ainley's Storm-Petrel, an enigmatic and vulnerable Mexican endemic. So Desi, take it away.
Thanks for the great introduction, and I will share my screen. Can you all see and hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. Today, I'll be talking about the identification of Ainley storm-petrels based on molt. So I'd like to begin by discussing the taxonomy of the Ainley storm-petrel. So in 2016, the Leach's storm-petrel was split into 3 species: Leach's, Townsend's, and Ainley's. All 3 of these species are small brownish seabirds, about the size of a towhee. The Leach's storm-petrel is currently comprised of 2 subspecies, Leucoroa and Chapmani. And then we also have the 2 species that were split from the Leach's, the Townsend's and the Ainley's. And as we'll see, these 3 species are incredibly difficult to separate from each other. For example, this bird on the water here is one of these 3, but I really have no idea which one it is, just because they are so hard to differentiate in the field. So let's take a brief look at each of these 3 species. So first, let's examine the Leach's storm-petrel, which is also the most common and widespread species of the group. The Leach's storm-petrel has a variable white rump patch, ranging from all white to all dark. And looking at the range map on the right, the red here represents their breeding range, and the blue represents their non-breeding distribution. You can see they're a very widespread species, breeding on small islands off Japan, through the Aleutians, and down to the coast of Central California. And they also breed in the Atlantic, on islands off the northeastern United States, as well as in Western Europe. And during the non-breeding season, they spend their time foraging out at sea, often hundreds of miles out of the sight of land. The Townsend storm-petrel looks very similar to the Leach's storm-petrel. It averages slightly smaller and shorter wings, but the 2 species breed in completely different places. The Townsend storm-petrel is a very range-restricted species, as it breeds only on Guadalupe Island off the coast of Mexico. After breeding, the Townsend storm-petrel is known to go north to the waters of Southern California. So on the right here, you can see an eBird map of the species distribution. I've circled Guadalupe Island in red, where they breed. And you can see that the majority of them seem to go north to the waters off of Southern California. Recently, however, Fernando Medrano has put radio transmitters on Townsend storm-petrels on Guadalupe Island and have tracked where they go when they're not breeding. And they found that some of the birds go way up north to the waters off San Francisco, much farther north than we originally thought. And finally, very little is known about the Ainley storm-petrel. There are no known visual differences from the Leach's storm-petrel, and like Townsend's, it is an endemic breeder to Guadalupe Island off the coast of Mexico. And because there are no known differences from the Leach's storm-petrel, there are no records of this species away from Guadalupe Island, and virtually nothing is known about its non-breeding distribution. On the right here, you can see an eBird map of its distribution, and you can see it's only been reported from Guadalupe Island, nowhere else. And on the left here is one of the very few photos that exist of an Ainley storm-petrel. I believe this bird crashed into a ship as the ship was passing by the breeding colony on Guadalupe Island during the night. So if Ainley's looks identical to leeches and breeds on the same island as Townsend's, then why was it split? Well, there are two reasons for this split. First, they have different vocalizations from leeches and Townsend's. And second, Ainley's breed during the winter. So what's happening on Guadalupe Island is that the Townsend's are nesting there during the summer. The Townsend's will leave, and then the Ainleys will come to nest during the winter. On the right here is Guadalupe Island. These storm petrels aren't nesting on the main island itself, but rather on small rocky islands on the south end of the main island. The Ainley storm petrel is one of the very few birds that both breeds in the northern hemisphere and breeds during the winter. Most birds, of course, breed during the summer in the northern hemisphere. But these two differences, the different vocalizations and the winter breeding, are of no use whatsoever when trying to identify these Ainley storm petrels away from Guadalupe Island, since they don't call when they're not nesting. So therefore, virtually nothing is known about its non-breeding distribution, and there are no records away from Guadalupe Island. So then how can we try and tell these two species apart, the Ainleys and the leeches? So I said that Ainley storm petrels breed in the winter, and that is correct. And could this winter breeding be used to identify these birds when they're not breeding? Well, birds generally molt their primaries at a time of year opposite to breeding. And because Ainleys breed during the winter, it could be presumed that they would molt during the summer, from say April to October. Leeches breeds in the summer and is known to molt its primaries in the winter. So therefore, it seems possible that primary molt could be used to distinguish Ainleys and leeches storm petrels. So therefore, Peter Pyle, Ryan TERRILL, and I started a project to try to identify these Ainley storm petrels based on the timing of primary molt. That's Peter on the left and Ryan on the right. So what does primary molt in a storm petrel look like? So looking on the bird on the left, you can see that it has 10 primary feathers, as all leeches storm petrels do, and as most birds do. The innermost primary is labeled P1, and the outermost primary is labeled P10. And primary molt in this species always starts at P1 and always ends at P10. So the direction of molt is from the innermost primary to the outermost primary. Looking on the bird on the right, you can see an example of a leeches storm petrel in molt. You can see that most of the primary feathers here are very blackish, very shiny, like the rest of the plumage. But then these two outer primary feathers are very brown and seem very worn and faded. So the very black primaries are the new feathers that the bird has molted in, and the browner feathers are the feathers that the bird has not yet molted in. And the feathers become browner over time due to exposure from the sun, which causes feathers to generally lose their color and become less shiny and iridescent. So again, our hypothesis is that birds molting their primaries during the summer could be Ainley storm petrels due to the nature of the species breeding in the winter. So to test whether molt timing could be used to identify Ainley storm petrels away from the breeding grounds, we looked for storm petrels molting their primaries at an odd time of year. And to do this, we examined specimens that were housed at various specimen collections throughout California. Each specimen has the location and date of where it was collected. So specimens are super useful for gathering data on birds. And the specimens were collected between 1872 and 2019. So a lot of these specimens were over 100 years old. We also examined hundreds of photographs of storm petrels from the Macaulay Library, or from photographs that were provided to us by photographers. And all of our specimens and photographed birds were from the Pacific Ocean. So in total, we examined 528 specimens at various specimen collections. These were comprised of 422 adults and 86 first-year birds. And of the 422 adults, 26 were in primary molt, and of the 86 first years, 23 were in primary molt. And the reason that so few were in primary molt is because the vast majority of the specimens were collected on the breeding grounds. And recall that birds do not breed in molt at the same time. So that's why so few were in molt. So to help assess molt timing in these birds, we gave each bird a primary score, indicating how many primaries it had replaced. So what this means is that the higher the primary score, the farther along in the molt it is. So we can take a look at this bird here, which we've seen a couple slides ago. And you can recall that the inner 8 primary feathers were very dark and glossy black, while the outer 2 primary feathers were very faded and brown. So that means this bird got a primary score of 8, because this means it has replaced 8 of its primaries, and it still has 2 primaries left to replace. So this bird is pretty far advanced in its molt. To be exact, it's 8/10 of the way done through its primary molt. So what did we find? Well, we found 5 potential adult Ainley storm-petrels. So looking at the figure here, on the y-axis here, you can see the primary score. Recall that a primary score of 10 means the bird is just finishing up molt, and a primary score of 2 means the bird is just starting molt. And the months of the year are here on the x-axis. So each dot represents a molting bird. And you can see that the majority of these dots are black. And let's focus on these for now. You can see that the earliest of this group that contains the black dots started molt in around October and finished molt in around February. And it makes sense that the line slants to the right because molt is a process that takes several months for an individual bird. And because the majority of our specimens were molting during the winter, as shown by these black dots, we presume that these black dots represented Leach's storm-petrels because they were molting during the winter. But however, you can also see that we had several birds that were molting at a different time of year from the rest, shown here in red. There were 5 birds that were molting their primaries during the summer, appearing to begin molt in around April and finishing molt in around October. And we consider these 5 birds that were molting during the summer as potential adult Ainley storm-petrels. The data for the first year birds was quite a bit messier, but like in the adults, we also had 2 clusters for molt timing. The majority of the birds were molting during the summer, as shown by these black dots here. But we also had several first year birds molting in midwinter, as shown by these red dots here. And this finding was definitely a bit unexpected because the first years were showing an opposite pattern to those of the adults. Recall that in the adults, the majority of our birds were molting during the winter, and 5 of them were molting during the summer. But here it seemed the opposite pattern was occurring. But one explanation for this is that the first years aren't actually nesting because they spend the entirety of their first year out at sea, away from the breeding grounds. And therefore, there's not really much pressure for the first years to molt at a specific time since they're not nesting. And that could explain the somewhat messier data compared to the adults. But nonetheless, 5 of the first year birds shown in red were found to be significantly different from the rest of our birds. And we consider these 5 birds to be potential first year Ainley storm-petrels. So let's look a little closer at these 10 potential Ainley storm-petrels. We found that 8 of the 10 potential Ainleys were found south of Guadalupe Island. So here's a map of where these birds were collected or photographed. The green triangles here represent first year birds, while the blue squares represent adult birds. And you can see that the majority of them seem to go south after breeding, even south to as far south as like several degrees south of the equator. So this was definitely interesting because recall that in the Townsend storm-petrel, which also breeds on Guadalupe Island, they tended to disperse north after breeding to the waters off of Southern California. But it seems Ainley's is doing something opposite. And whether this is related to the fact that they molt or that they breed at an opposite time of year is unknown, but it was definitely an interesting finding. So in conclusion, these 10 birds could represent the first records of Ainley storm-petrels away from Guadalupe Island. And as I mentioned earlier, Fernando Medrano has tagged Townsend storm-petrels and has found a lot of information about where they go when they're not breeding. And he plans to return to Guadalupe Island in the winter to try to tag Ainley storm-petrels. So that could provide a much clearer picture of the non-breeding distribution of Ainleys. And of course, these 10 birds are just potential Ainleys right now. To actually confirm that they are Ainleys, we need to do genetic analysis on these 10 birds, which is certainly something we hope to do in the future. So thank you all for coming. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Peter Pyle and Ryan TERRILL, who worked with me on this project, as well as to all the curators of specimen collections who allowed us to have access to their specimen collections, namely Kimball Garrett, Phil Unit, Maureen Flannery, Jack Dumbauscher, Carla Cicero, and Linnea Hall. And we'd also like to thank those who supplied photographs for us to analyze. These people were Amy McAndrews, Jorge Montejo, Thomas Blackman, and Robin Baird. And again, thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Desi. Very intriguing situation. I was wondering, are there other examples of species that are so cryptic that they've been described or split just based on vocalizations, time of year of breeding, but there are no morphological or plumage differences?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's a similar thing happening with the bandrum storm-petrels in the Atlantic. There's several subspecies of bandrum storm-petrels, and there's several motions to split these subspecies, but they all look pretty much exactly the same. But they do kind of a similar thing where they have different vocalizations, and a couple of the subspecies breed at a different time of year, and therefore probably molt at a different time of year. So yeah, it would be interesting to do the same study on bandrum storm-petrels to see if that would work for them as well.
Interesting. Thanks. A couple questions here. Desi, do you base your assertion that Townsend's dispersed north solely on the eBird sightings? Would those not be a result of effort?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because there certainly are a lot more pelagics off of Southern California than there are, like, say, near the equator. But as I mentioned, there's a researcher tagging Townsend's on Guadalupe Island, and putting radio transmitters on them, and they have found that the vast majority of their birds are dispersing north, which correlates with the eBird data, and even as far north as San Francisco. So it seems like Townsend's truly do go north because, yeah, in combination of the eBird data and the radio transmitter data.
All right, a related question. If those northern records of Ainleys are right, maybe they go way offshore beyond where collecting has been done.
That's another excellent idea. Yeah, because we had like one bird off Oregon and one bird off California that were hundreds of miles offshore. So it definitely seems possible that they could just be going farther offshore than the other subspecies or than the other species, and that's why we're not really detecting them.
All right. Just to clarify, are you using the term first-year birds for individuals who are technically in their second calendar year of life that are going through their second basic molt?
Yes, this applies, or yes, it applies to it's like the first year of the bird's life would be the way to think about this. Yeah.
All right. And Phil Unit says, please let me know if any of the prospective Ainleys were from our collection.
Oh, I would have to double check that. I believe one was. So yeah, once, we certainly want to go back to these specimen collections to try and see if we can detect maybe any morphological differences or any differences in plumage among these 10. So yeah, certainly once maybe the pandemic is over, we can go back to specimen collections and hopefully get more data. So yeah, but I believe one was in your collection, Phil. And I'll let you know which one.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, we can all look forward to the results of the telemetry studies and genetics analysis. Certainly a lot more to be learned on this, but you all have moved things along in the right direction. So thanks a lot, Desi. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
All right. Our next speaker is no stranger to the audience, not only because of all of his contributions to ornithology over the years, but because a number of other speakers in this conference have already referenced input they got from Peter Pyle when they performed their own research. Peter Pyle is an ornithologist and marine biologist who has studied the ecology of birds, pinnipeds, and sharks in California, Hawaii, and throughout the Pacific. Peter specializes in bird molt and its use in aging birds, and as you can see here, identifying birds. Peter currently works for the Institute of Bird Populations in Petaluma, California, and today he'll be speaking about examination of digital images from Macaulay Library to determine avian molt strategies, a case study in North American hummingbirds. And he'll also be providing some bonus material talking about subspecies as well. So please welcome Peter Pyle.
All right, thanks, Steve. Are we all on?
Yes, you are.
Let me get set up here. Oops. All right, we good?
So you share your screen and then we'll be able to see it.
We're not good then. Hold on a second. Always something, sorry.
That's all right.
All right, and now there, good?
You're not sharing your screen yet.
Not yet.
So if you hit the green button at the bottom, it says share screen, and it'll give you selections that you can choose. Choose one and then hit share.
Oh, I see. Okay. Where am I? Sorry, I'm not a big zoomie.
It's okay. A lot of us are not good, big zoomies.
Boy, I can't even find it on the board here. I talk.
The share screen button, or
No, I hit the share screen button and I get the choices, but sorry, everybody. I'm wasting my time here.
is it a PowerPoint or is it a slide?
It's a PowerPoint.
Okay. Is it on your desktop? Oh, there you go. You're sharing.
Okay, so we got that far.
Okay, and now I can see what is in your internet browser. So
Can you see it now?
I do not see the file that you're sharing. I just see the Zoom screen on your web browser. So if you can find the file and open it.
It's opened.
It is open. Okay. Try taking it out of share screen. Actually, I'll stop your sharing and let's try it again and choose a different thing to share.
Okay, I got it, I think now.
Aha, there it is.
Okay, good.
Now you can just start the slide presentation and it should show. There you go.
Okay, sorry. All right, I'm going to move quickly here because I want to get to a couple rabbit holes. As a lot of you know, I'm revising my identification guide to North American birds, and it's as typical, I guess. It's taking a lot longer than I'd hoped. And one of the reasons is I keep finding rabbit holes to go down. So I want to take you down a couple of rabbit holes. And as those who know me know that once I go down a rabbit hole, I don't come up until every speck of dirt has been analyzed. So the first rabbit hole here is is this thing visible here? The control thing? Probably not.
We see your screen, rabbit hole number 1.
Okay, very good. Is clarifying the molts of 8 species of hummingbirds that occur in the Southwest primarily. And these are Rivolis, blue-throated mountain jam, lucifers, broad-billed, white-eared violet crown, barreline, and buff-bellied. And as an example of what I was running across, now why isn't my thing? Okay, there we go. For broad-billed hummingbird, for example, in 1997, I concluded that certain thing about the performative molt occurred in November to May and the pre-basic in October to April. Steve Howell concluded a different set of month ranges for both, and Sherry Williamson concluded a third set, and the birds of North America concluded a fourth set, which actually, that's Powers and Wetherington, came closer to what I ended up finding because of Susan Wetherington's good work with Molt in Arizona. But note all authors indicated that the preformative molt was complete and the pre-basic molt was quite protracted. So, and I also, good talk, by the way, Desi, wanted to see how molts in these species might fit in with clarifying molt and plumage terminology as well. That's been a subject of mine, especially since we were able to document pre-alternate molts in a couple species. Okay, so it started innocently enough. You know, I thought, okay, maybe I'll look at a couple photos of broad-billed hummingbird and see if I can figure anything out. And so I went to Macaulay and clicked on, and it's Cornell Labs Ornithology's Macaulay Library, which is the focus of this talk. But as you can see, there's a tremendous resource here to be able to study not just molt, but subspecies and a lot of other things. And as of this morning, there were almost 30 million images loaded into Macaulay. So I'm gonna go quickly through the molt section here to save time for subspecies, but you know, and also because molt is kind of esoteric and boring to a lot of people. But I asked Steve to put the URL link into the chat box. This is a preprint, which is an ability now to put unpublished manuscripts online for others to view and comment on before you publish them. So this one's currently in review at Wilson. But if you go to this link, you can download the PDF and the supplementary material and find out more about what I'm doing here. I do want to spend a little time with methods, since that's really critical to this whole thing. A lot of you know this now. You know, when I did this project, it was about a year ago, and I wasn't quite sure how all it went, but now I am. And so from the eBird homepage, you hit explore here, and then you hit search photos and sounds, and then you put your species in here into the box, and up come photos. And just a note here that there's 15,222 images of broad-billed in the library now as of this morning. Then filtering is real important. And I know Bryce Robinson was going to go through this a little bit with you before he got cut off, but so I got you covered. The things that were important for this study to filter for were location, date, and this box over here, which is covered by my thing here. Let me move this out of the way. Recently uploaded. And then, so once you hit location, you have, and the filtering system that Macaulay has is amazing to me, very superb. You have a choice of entering where you want to limit your photos to. So for this project, I limited it mainly to the United States. For about 5 species, I had enough data to do everything from the US, but for the others, I had to go down to the Mexican plateau, which I was then able to filter for Mexico and find those birds as well. And then what I did is I went month by month. So I start with July. July, all years means since 1901 or whatever, and came up. And in this case, there were 1,554 images of broad-billed hummingbird taken in July. So it's quite a sample size to be able to work through. And then over here, you have a choice between recently uploaded, best quality, date of newest first, and so on. And I chose date of newest first because that allowed me to actually track individuals. And so I could, you'd hit an individual, say a vagrant often, and then you'd be able to just know it was the same bird and not include it in the sample size because it's the same individual. And this gets also back to what Hannah Floyd was talking about the other day about being able to watch a single bird all the way through the molt process. And I think the record was a broad-billed hummingbird vagrant back in North Carolina that probably had 400 photos, and I was able to track it through the entire molt. So that was the process I went through, put those filters on, and then go month by month and categorize each hummingbird into these 6 categories: juvenile, undergoing preformative molt, formative, undergoing second pre-basic, definitive basic, and undergoing definitive pre-basic molt. And you can see I had some big sample sizes here. And this was a year ago. I had 8,842. Now that's up to 15,000. And by going through a process, I eliminated the same bird and came up with 2,413 individuals by month. These are the numbers by month, 639 in July. And there were less of some of the species, but the range went from 280 in white-eared to 2,413 in broad-billed. So the first thing I wanted to look at was sequence. And the sequence I found to be absolutely fixed, and as reported in the literature, where instead of like the Storm-Petrels, Desi mentioned, go from P1 to P10, hummingbirds do something funny. They get to P8 and then they drop P10, and P9's the last feather dropped. And so I was able to confirm in all 2,000 plus images of birds in active molt, I did not find any exception to this. And I also was able to document that the secondaries start in the middle with S1 and S6 and converge, and that S4, the 4th secondary, is almost always the last feather replaced. So timing was not so fixed, is more plastic in these 8 species. And I'll quickly just point out that the beige here is preformative molt, the green is pre-basic molt, definitive pre-basic molt, and then the purple are birds I identified as being in second pre-basic molt. And just a quick note that the timing is relatively fixed. You can see that for most species. It's not protracted like I thought it was. And that as far as month ranges went, nobody had it right before. So this is able to eliminate that. Extended molt is also pretty plastic. It turns out that, and I'd known this before, even though we said these 2 Rivolis and blue-throated mountain gems had complete molts, they actually have partial molts. And you can see at a year of age, they still have worn out juvenile primaries. Same with these 3 species here. The interesting guys are lucifers, which seems to only have a limited to partial body feather molt, and that's very similar to other North American smaller species. And then broad-billed, which really was the most variable, its preformative molt could go from partial to complete. And then white-eared also stood out as being the only one with a complete molt. So again, the limited to partial involves body feathers, some gorget feathers, sometimes most or all of the body feathers, but it didn't, this was well before any primaries got dropped. Partial, as I described, retaining the juvenile feathers. I found a few birds, it was pretty much less than 4% that had incomplete molts, where they would replace 1 or 2 primaries and then stop. So in this broad build, it's hard to see, but P1 and P2 have been replaced, and now it's been arrested, I believe. So it won't molt anymore. And then the white-eared was different. And that's that it's for all of these species, pretty much, except the broad bills that did molt primaries, the body feathers would get replaced partially or almost completely before primaries went. And in the white-eared, as soon as the body feathers started getting replaced, the primaries did too. So P1 and P3 are already dropped in this bird, and it's barely even started the body feather molt. So that's more in line with complete molts in birds in general, whereas having body feathers get replaced well before primaries is not a common strategy. So as you can imagine, all of this molt information really affects how you determine the age. So as supplementary material to the paper, I put together a little primer on how to age and sex all of these species, and that's at this link here, which you can also get through the other link I provided. So molt terminology, I do believe my results support the fact that that in at least the lucifer, and this goes for all of our other migratory common species, Annas and black-shinned and rufus, that the first replacement of primary should be considered the second pre-basic molt pulled forward, rather than part of a complete preformative molt, which is how we all had it before. And over here, I kind of put months. This is kind of back of the envelope, but months from the first preformative molt I saw body feathers to the first primary being dropped. And for most of these species, you can see there's a range ranging from 6 months in lucifers up to 11 in a couple of them. So in other words, when the first body feather molted, it wasn't until 11 months afterwards that the first primary molted. Now, if there was a preformative, if I considered the primary as being part of the preformative molt, this number was 0 for white-eared. You know, as soon as a body feather molt was molted, so was a primary, and only 1 month between those two things in broadbill. So I think this represents a clear difference between this group of species. And the key one here is lucifers, which also goes along with Rufus and all of our others, so that they only start that molt about 6 months after the preformative molt starts. But it seems to me to fit better into these other guys than it does to considering that molt complete. Now, of course, when you interpret these molts, you want to do it not by anything that we're seeing today, not by timing or location or extent, but by how they evolved along ancestral lineages. And so you have to think about it in a different way. And unfortunately, because extent, timing, and location are very plastic, they're not very good markers to use to try to interpret the evolution of molts sequences. But as we gain more data on molts in birds of the world, I think we'll probably be able to get somewhere with location, extent, and other parameters of molt that'll allow us to possibly identify homologies along the line from ancestral species. And then I quickly looked at these molt patterns relative to the phylogeny of hummingbirds, and was sort of surprised to find that actually the molt extent did kind of fit with the phylogeny. The mountain gems had partial molts, and that included giant hummingbird Patagonia, which I'd already discovered had a partial molt through a UC Davis project. And that Lucifer and amongst all the bee clade, which is ours, have limited to partial molts, and that all these other molts. The emeralds are quite variable, but Stiles in 2017, this is based over here on McGuire et al. 2014, but at Stiles indicated, split the group into 4, and actually these also divided by those groups, like white-eared was in its own group. Anyway, I don't think this is the answer, that we still have about 300 species of hummingbirds that we don't know anything about molt of. And because the timing and extent of molts is plastic, I believe it's going to end up being have more to do with environmental variables than to phylogeny. So the conclusion on the molt study is that clearly a significant resource to Macaulay Library is clearly a significant resource to study molt. So I asked, which of these 2 photos is more informative to me? And so, and then I also asked, please take and upload images of birds and molt. 76% of males in my sample looked like this, and only about 23% looked like that. And I also want to say, do not neglect the females. 79% of hummingbird photos were this, 21% were females. So, you know, we do have a bias when we're out there to take photos of these guys, but they're relatively uninformative as far as molt studies go. And same thing for just about any birds. Here's the equivalent with gulls. Here's the equivalent with humans. I won't stay on that very long. And as acknowledgements for the molt study, I wanted to especially acknowledge the contributors who upload photos to eBird, because, you know, 30 million photos, you got a lot of contributors. I relied on 174 of them to do this paper where I actually show figures or do links. And here are some names for just one of the age primer. So all these people, you know, we can't do this without you guys. So that's great. Okay, promised I'd go down a second rabbit hole with you all here. I hope I have enough time. the second rabbit hole is I started in 1997. I basically just followed subspecies for whatever the latest authority said, and it was pretty inconsistent and haphazard. And since then, a lot of papers have come out, you know, sort of questioning some subspecies, or the genomic information is not matching up very well with the phenotypic information when it comes to molts. In other words, the genetics don't seem to align up with how the subspecies are being identified. So I made a fateful decision to kind of try to review subspecies again and do something about it. So what I did is, I'm again using Macaulay, and it's another great resource for this. What you can do is filter for the state or even the county within California, and then pick a time of year. For resident species, I'd always pick October to December, because that's when they're in their freshest plumage, which should look alike and not affected by wear. And I'd find stuff like this, where I couldn't even tell any of them apart, let alone a certain percentage of them. So I'm starting to, and I want to be careful here. Let me see. I want to say, for the revision, I'm going to be proposing a more conservative approach. So I don't know how exactly that's going to come out. I might not even recommend subspecies, except to say, indicate which subspecies I think are actually identifiable, especially for a single individual bird in the hand, if you have a 75% chance of identifying it. Or, you know, I might be in a bad mood and suggest they just get lumped. But anyway, here are some results so far, and I'll leave the screen on for questions in case you want to mull it over. For instance, here, one Savannah sparrow, I'm going to recommend reducing it from 14 to 8. And that's based a lot on Rising's 2007 paper on this subject, over splitting of subspecies. And when I hit that paper, that's when I decided I'd go back and do all of this. And he actually is more conservative. I think he only recommends 6. So I'm not being quite that conservative. And I do want to point out that in some cases, the subspecies seem to be pretty good. Junco, I went from 12 to 10. Stellar's Jay, California Jay were pretty good ones. Possible monotypy, which means they're monotypic, only one, no subspecies, are these. And I want to point out that a lot of these are highly migratory. So for instance, it's kind of hard for me to imagine that Pacific slope flycatchers that migrate from Mexico to the Channel Islands are going to be that different from the ones that land on the mainland. And then other things I'm looking at are how much clinal variation there might be in measurements and in appearance, and also how much variation in plumage there is within described subspecies. And that's quite substantial in a lot of the cases. You know, with the bush tits, of course, I purposely picked 4 that looked identical, but you know, if you look at 10 images of each from a certain state in October, December, you might see average differences, but I just don't know if it's a practical delineation. I also want to say I'm not at all questioning all the people who put a lot of work into describing these subspecies, and I'm sure that their work is valid, that there are these average differences. I guess I'm just going to try to present a more practical view of it. Luke DeSicchio's, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, study, I noticed on his intergrades, I would now recommend they be switched to those 2, from Sinuosa to Zaboria to Townsend versus Iliaca. And Luke actually mentioned that in this case, everything that seemed to be clinal along the Alaska and northern British Columbia coast, and that's what it looked like from images, and not only images. By the way, for migratory species, I would choose the month ranges April to June, or May to July, depending on the species. But you know, to get actual birds that were breeding there rather than migrant birds. So anyway, that's all I got. Oh, and American crow, I just wanted to mention I was surprised to read Slager et al., which when he split the northwestern crow, he not only split lumped the northwestern crow, recommended lumping it. He not only lumped it as a species, but indicated that the subspecies wasn't even valid because of clinal variation with other supposed subspecies in every direction. So if that's going to be the new normal, then all the other subspecies of American crow vary by size only. There's a few little other things, but it just doesn't seem like there's much there to work with on the subspecies level. So there you go. I'm ready for questions.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Fascinating as expected. And we have time for a few questions. One, are there enough images of Xanthusis hummingbird to see if it follows the white-eared's different molt strategy?
I'll bet there is. I haven't done it because it's not going to be in my book. So I have to focus on that first. But yeah, very good question. And I'll bet, maybe in another 5 years, whenever I get done with this, I'll take a look at that question as well.
For the migratory species, broad-tailed rufous, calliope, and black-chinned in the west, John Dunn has not noted flight feather molt in late summer and fall.
You mean birds moving south? All of those guys molt on the wintering grounds once they get to the wintering grounds, and that's why they're 6 months offset from when they do start the body molt. But John, I'm sure you've seen the birds flying south, the young males that have started to molt their gorget and have a few brilliant gorget feathers. Well, that's what I'm now, and Desi and I concluded for rufous hummingbird, is what we're going to call the preformative molt, and rather than the beginning of the preformative molt followed by the end of it on the wintering grounds. And by the way, I did not see any evidence for pre-alternate molts in any of those 8 species, but that would be very hard to detect from photos.
All right, and there's a question, how do you tell that a hummingbird had an arrested molt?
By the fact that those few birds that had stopped the molt, first of all, they weren't actively molting at the time. And hummingbirds, when they molt, you see at least one feather's dropped all the way through the molt. They have a timing of it where one feather drops and the other one drops before the last one's grown in. So you always see at least one molting or growing, whereas in those cases, they were all complete, just sitting there, no molt. And second, I would find birds all the way through 1-year-old bird, say broad-billed hummingbirds that had molted P1 to 4. They were all pretty worn looking, but the P1 to 4 had obviously molted a year earlier, and then the molt had stopped. So there was clearly no continuation. Of course, I don't know that in the next molt it didn't start with P5 in that case, but it just wouldn't fit in with what we know.
All right, and then finally, John Dunn says in Savannah sparrows, possibly bush tits, there are likely 2 species involved, and he reminded us that the AOS has rectified the crows, the Northwestern and American crows.
Yeah.
So
I'm a relic myself. I'm more of a lumper when it comes to this kind of thing, but so I guess I'll reflect that in my subspecies. But I'm going to be careful, and I'm going to maybe not even recommend that they be synonymized, but more say, here's a different take, and for practical reasons, this is what would be useful, or something like that.
all right. Well, thanks a lot, Peter. We love hearing at these conferences about whatever rabbit hole you've been going down most recently. So we really do appreciate it. Thanks a lot. All right, and then wrapping up this session, and just so folks know, we have 30 minutes between this session and the next one, so it's fine if this next talk goes long. Wrapping up this session will be Lori Hargrove. Lori studies bird nesting ecology and species distributions, including responses to fire and climate change. Her research includes National Science Foundation funded Grinnell resurvey projects, documenting and interpreting changes to species distribution over the past 100 years. Today, Lori will be speaking about LeConte's Thrasher status and nest site requirements in the Coachella Valley and surrounding Colorado desert region. So welcome, Lori.
Hi, thank you. So let's share my screen. Share. Can you all see that fine?
Yeah. Yes, we can see you and hear you fine.
Good, good. Okay, so I'm very happy to share with you some results from our 2019 study on the LeConte Thrasher, which has been declining in the Coachella Valley, as well as elsewhere. We set out to investigate why and to learn more about its nest site requirements there and in the surrounding Colorado desert region. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge my co-author, Phil Unit, who you heard talk this morning, and our team of field workers who did all the hard work. It was just 5 of us, myself, Phil, Kim Furry, Kevin Clark, and Leah Squires. Okay, so let's see, advance. There we go. So most of our current knowledge of LeConte Thrasher is thanks to Jay Shepard, who studied this species intensively in the San Joaquin Valley near Maricopa, but also summarized the species' natural history throughout its range. The LeConte Thrasher is a desert specialist, probably one of the best examples of an avian desert specialist that we have. And it's found in some of the driest and most desolate parts of our southwestern deserts. It has a declining trend according to the Breeding Bird Survey, but it's not well sampled by that survey. Its range overlaps closely with the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. The Colorado Desert is the western part of the Sonoran Desert along the Colorado River and west around the Salton Sea, where it's particularly dry. LeConte Thrashers basically need desert habitat with open stretches of sand to forage on ground arthropods, which they dig for with their sickle-shaped bills. And they need at least a few large shrubs for nesting and for shelter. The rather bulky nests require shrubs with sufficient support and concealment from the sun and from predators. Here's one of their bulky nests with the bowl on top distinctively lined by a soft padding. We know that the historic distribution of LeConte Thrashers included the Coachella Valley here between the San Jacinto Mountains on the left and Joshua Tree National Park hiding on the right. We know that because of all the historic specimens that were collected in this area. In fact, according to VertNet, Palm Springs was by far the biggest collecting locality anywhere in the species range. 124 specimens were collected across each decade from the 1880s to the 1930s there, after which Palm Springs was converted to communities and golf courses. So there's obviously a strong bias when it comes to collecting localities, but this firmly establishes the region as formally important. By comparison, there were only 3 specimens collected in Joshua Tree National Park historically, over here on the right, which was well covered by collectors during the 1940s and 50s. Now, there's no big mystery why the LeConte Thrasher has declined in the Coachella Valley. In this current satellite imagery and on the next slide, you can see the widespread conversion to agriculture, suburban sprawl, and golf courses. But all was not lost. There is still some extensive sand all around the Coachella Valley, lovely sand. And the Coachella Valley Multiple Species and Habitat Conservation Plan was established to conserve the remaining natural habitats and species, and LeConte Thrasher was identified as a target species for conservation. They conducted their first baseline surveys for LeConte Thrasher in 2004 and 5. And they had many detections at 4 out of the 7 sites that they surveyed in the Coachella Valley. Those are the sites with blue circles, and the little tiny green dots are LeConte Thrasher detections. Then 10 years later, they did a resurvey in 2014, and they expanded their sampling locations based on a habitat model. Here, the teeny tiny dark blue dots represent new survey points. But unfortunately, only one site had possible detections. At the far left side here, Stubby Canyon, at the mouth of Stubby Canyon. Their conclusion was that it was possibly a drought-induced decline, but they were uncertain about what other factors could be at play and what their monitoring or management strategy should be going forward. So that is where we came in. 5 years later, in 2019, our museum, the San Diego Natural History Museum, was tasked with the third monitoring survey for LeConte thrashers in the Coachella Valley. And we approached the problem with 3 questions. What is the current status of the thrasher in the Coachella Valley? Second, if the decline has continued, what is causing it? And third, hypothesizing that habitat quality is an issue, we focused on territory and nest site requirements. And even though 2019 did follow a wet winter, we expected very low sample sizes. So our strategy was to resurvey all the previous sites, plus add more survey sites based on mostly on previous records, use multiple survey methods, and to learn more about territory and nest site requirements, we expanded our study areas to include Joshua Tree National Park to the north at higher elevations and Anza-Borrego Desert State Park to the south at lower elevations. So we used a combination of 3 survey methods. First, we used a survey protocol that was developed by the Desert Thrasher Working Group, who are doing range-wide surveys for Bendire's and LeConte thrashers, but had not done much work yet at all in the Colorado desert. This was a timed plot search without broadcast. Second, we also used the methods that had been developed by the MSHCP, which were based on 6 points per site along a pair of 1 kilometer long transects with broadcast. And third, we use unconstrained area searching. So in summary, at each study site, we used these 3 methods, which took approximately 3 hours per visit. Our first round of surveys was in January to February, and we repeated these surveys up to 4 times at unoccupied sites, but switched to territory mapping and nest monitoring at occupied sites. We set up 29 of these study sites in the Coachella Valley with this 3-pronged approach. That's each red square on the map. Each red square is 1 kilometer wide, by the way. Plus 11 additional sites that were opportunistic area searching only, the red circles, for a total of 40 study sites. And we use these same survey methods at Joshua Tree National Park and Anza-Borrego Desert State Park, but with fewer study sites there. For habitat measures, we used modified Desert Thrasher Working Group protocols, but with the 300 square meter plots centered on each nest as a centroid for comparison to unoccupied plots. And in addition to estimating various habitat coverages, we measured the average distance between shrubs, shrub heights, width, the friability or looseness of the sand with the penetrometer, and percent composition of sand, silt, and gravel with the sieve set. Now for results. So starting in Joshua Tree, we had 12 study sites total. This is the southeast part of Joshua Tree, Pinto Basin on the top there down to Cottonwood Springs. And so out of, at 12 study sites, we spent 60 hours using those 3 survey methods. And we detected LeConte thrasher at 11 of the 12 sites in blue. And we found a total of 17 LeConte thrasher nests. At Anza-Borrego, we had 20 study sites total and spent 115 hours using these 3 survey methods, from all the way from Clark Dry Lake area at the top down to Carrizo Wash at the bottom, for you familiar with Anza-Borrego. So out of these 20 sites, we had 9 sites where we had LeConte thrasher detections, and we found a total of 9 LeConte thrasher nests. So that represents, compared to the bird atlas 20 years earlier, that suggested a decline in occupancy. At the Coachella Valley, we spent a whopping 220 hours of field work using those 3 methods. And we detected no LeConte thrashers at all and no nests. So this was a lot of work and pretty disappointing, but we had a few desert adventures out there like this one. Phil and Kim one day had this experience. And we had some rewards, like this beautiful nest in Joshua Tree. So of the 26 nests that we found in Joshua Tree and Anza-Borrego, average clutch size of 4 was a bit higher than reported in the literature, which is 3.3. Only 2 of the nests clearly failed. A few had uncertain outcome. But we observed fledglings in most territories, with at least one territory having 3 successive broods. So there appeared to be very good reproductive success in 2019. They nested in a variety of shrubs, but strongly favored cholla. Nests were often completely hidden from view from the sides and from overhead. When mesquite was used, each time the nest was placed directly beneath a clump of mistletoe. This mesquite in Borrego Valley supported 3 successive nests, each placed below a different roof of mistletoe. Here are a few more examples of chollas that are completely concealing a LeConte thrasher nest. But we were able to photo document all the nests. Clutch size ranged from 3 eggs in this nest to 5 eggs, if you can see in there, which is rare in the literature, but this was one of 4 nests that we found with a clutch of 5 eggs. However, in each case of the nest with 5 eggs, in each case, one of the eggs did not hatch. And a nest with young nestlings, this is in a pencil cholla. And here's a new fledgling about 1 day out of the nest, unable to fly, hiding in agave in San Felipe Wash. And an older fledgling about 3 weeks out of the nest in Joshua Tree. Note the bill only slightly decurved compared to an adult in the next picture. This adult is perched on its nest substrate in Smoke Tree Wash. And unfortunately, the only juvenile that we found away from a known territory was found dead, tangled in a desert star vine. Of all the habitat measures, one that really stood out was the lack of cholla at most of the Coachella Valley sites. That's the dark red bar on the left, compared to nest plots and unoccupied plots in Joshua Tree in the green bars and Anza-Borrego in the orange bars. And those are 95% confidence intervals. Cholla die-off from recent droughts had been documented in the region, along with fires facilitated by invasive grasses and mustards. The importance of cholla for LeConte thrasher nesting in the Coachella Valley was noted by several biologists historically, including in the very first issue of the Auk, Frank Stevens, who you heard Phil talk about this morning, who also shared a few desert travel tips. And in his paper on the crystal thrasher in the Coachella Valley, Hannah mentions that LeConte thrasher nests were nearly all in cacti, 99% of the nests that he had seen. A few large remnant cholla can still be found in the Palm Springs area, as in this lot on the left. And there are still a few nice patches, such as at Snow Creek. LeConte thrashers can use other types of shrubs and may need only one really good shrub for nesting. However, by counting and ranking the quality of potential nest shrubs at each plot, we found that nest plots contained many more high quality shrubs compared to unoccupied plots, both in Joshua Tree, the green bars, and at Anza-Borrego in the orange bars. So the nest plots are the 2 highest bars there compared to unoccupied plots. And they were fewest at Coachella Valley in the red bar on the left. Jay Shepard sent us photos he took in habitat near desert hot springs at the upper end of the Coachella Valley that was occupied by LeConte thrasher 50 years ago. Just two examples here that we retook at the exact same localities. So this one is a reminder that a lot of the decline has obviously been due to development, including recent development. But in other areas with conserved habitat, we also see a decline in cholla and other suitable nest shrubs. At this site, we see replacement by creosote along with invasive mustard. An average creosote is not sufficient to support and conceal a LeConte thrasher nest, although we did find a shrike nest in this tangled creosote on the right. The shrike and mockingbird nests we noticed were quite a bit smaller and more flexible, with more and occurred in a more wide variety of nest substrates. We found many other differences between nest plots and unoccupied plots. For example, there was a lot of variation, but nest plots tended to have less compacted soil. So they had looser, more friable soil or sand. So it suggests that the thrashers are being very selective about the areas that they choose to nest in. We used 10 habitat measures that had some predictive ability to rank the Coachella Valley sites in terms of habitat quality. Since our nest plot sample size was fairly low, we just used the minimum and maximum measures of nest plots as thresholds and scored each site as 0 if it fell outside that threshold or 1 if it fell within the threshold. So based on that scoring, we identified the top highest quality sites for which we recommended more frequent monitoring and suggested that monitoring include nest searching. We also identified the sites that would be good candidates for experimentation with cholla restoration. And I just heard recently that the Coachella Valley conservation folks do have plans for that underway. Finally, another important consideration are nest predators and competitors. At least in the case of the common raven and northern mockingbird, those have increased dramatically in the Coachella Valley, and the loggerhead shrike is still very common. But except for LeConte thrasher, there was not a big difference in this community between the Coachella Valley, Joshua Tree, and Anza-Borrego. Rather, we suggest that increases in predators make the quality of nest substrates all the more important, and that increases in nest competitors make the quantity of nest substrates all the more important. We did find a few crystal thrashers in the Coachella Valley, which have declined compared to historic numbers. And interestingly, we had many observations of California thrashers, which have apparently spread into the floor of the Coachella Valley fairly recently. We suspect that some recent eBird records of LeConte thrasher in the Coachella Valley may be misidentifications. In conclusion, the LeConte thrasher is now extirpated or nearly extirpated from the Coachella Valley. Multiple causes of decline are likely, but we suspect that reduced habitat quality has contributed, especially the reduction of chollas and other large shrubs. We would like to repeat this study one more year for better sample size, and if possible, extend it into a few other parts of the Colorado Desert where populations are known to occur, such as the Coachella Valley, Algodones Dunes, and Utah Desert. We would also like to sample the ground arthropod community at nest sites versus unoccupied sites, as that is likely to be another good habitat quality indicator and an important consideration when it comes to habitat restoration. And I hope I can answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lori. That was an excellent presentation and a very thorough study. Every time I came up with a question, your next slide answered it. We do have one question here. Is bill length and curvature a reliable indicator of age?
Very good question. I don't know the answer to that, except that, as you could see in those pictures that I showed, you could definitely see the difference between a juvenile that was 3 weeks old versus an adult that was at least a year old, and so it's at least easy, a reliable way to tell the difference between a young juvenile and an adult. But that and that juvenile that I showed that had died in the desert star vine, its bill was still noticeably shorter than an adult bill.
All right. And your talk made the connection between cholla abundance and availability and LeConte's Thrasher abundance and distribution, very clearly. Is there good hope that the cholla restoration will succeed and will help the Thrashers?
It remains to be seen, of course. It's possible, one huge problem is, or hurdle is that, or stumbling or barrier is that LeConte's Thrasher is a permanent resident that doesn't disperse a lot. And so that could prevent, even if there's suitable habitat and the habitat quality is improved in the Coachella Valley, it could take a number of years for a recolonization event to occur. Perhaps a few good wet winters would be needed before a possible recolonization could occur. And yeah, I just heard literally 2 days ago that they are considering some cholla restoration in some areas.
That's good. One comment, there was a LeConte's Thrasher nesting attempt near Fallon, Nevada earlier this year. The eBird lists were just put in the chat by Ben Sonnenberg. So that's an interesting observation. A question, what about the status around the west and east sides, where I must admit I see little in the way of cholla cactus? I have seen a few around Salton City.
Yeah, so we don't have, a great idea of the extent of cholla historically, but we've read a lot of historic biologists' field notes, and so we have more clues from that. So for example, at Mecca in 1908, historic biologists noted there were several species of cacti there. Today, it's hard to find any cacti anywhere near Mecca. They commented that the cacti there were several species, but that they were not below sea level. So there was a division between above sea level where there was cactus and below sea level. And we have other biologists, another example, J. Smeaton Chase, I can't remember the year, from his book Desert Travels, 1910 maybe. And he describes there being so much cholla at the north end of the Coachella Valley that it was really hard to get through it on his horse. So,
Wow.
And today, if you go through the same area, you just find a couple of old trunks.
Wow. All right. And last question from someone who's done Thrasher surveys throughout Nevada. Is curious if you have any comments on northward or upslope movements of LeConte's Thrashers.
Well, if you did an analysis, of the region that I studied, it would appear to show an upward elevational shift because the Coachella Valley is much lower elevation than Joshua Tree. And, we have such good numbers up in Joshua Tree. So if you did an analysis of that, it would look like an upward elevational shift. But as far as dispersive movements up and down slope, very little has been noted. So, they must, of course, but they're weak flyers, and they're not. Jay Shepard makes a point of that they're really weak dispersers.
All right. Well, Lori, thanks a lot. Thanks for an excellent presentation, and thanks to all the presenters this afternoon. Really fascinating. So now John Harris will talk to us about the next activity we have upcoming.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the presenters. Our next speaker is going to be Christian Cooper, who will speak on the topic of the bother of brotherhood and birding. That's going to be at 2 o'clock, so we have about a 15 or 16 minute break.